Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel, How to Talk About Asian American Gender-Based Violence. This is a collaboration between the LA Times, the USC Annenberg Center for Health Journalism, the Cambodian Family, and Viet Rainbow of Orange County. I'm one of your panelists. I'm the assistant editor for the Los Angeles Times Utility Journalism team. Our mission is to help Southern Californians solve problems and make decisions through service journalism. And my co-moderator is Agnes, who can introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this event this evening. I'm Agnes Constante. I'll be one of the co-moderators for tonight's event. I am a freelance journalist and a reporting fellow at USC Annenberg Center for Health Journalism.
And I'd like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Anjali.
Hi all, I'm Anjali Alimchandani. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a psychologist in private practice. I am also an advisory board member of the National Queer and Transgender Therapists of Color Network. I'm also a person who stutters, so you will definitely hear that as I speak. And just to give you a little bit of sense of my background and kind of why I am here, I specialize in trauma work and in the intersections of structural oppression and trauma. To that end, I've worked with the homeless population, asylees, survivors of torture, and prior to coming to the field of psychology, I did a lot of social justice advocacy work. So I worked in international development. I got a policy degree and also worked with the Asian, with AAPI women and domestic violence. Yeah, I'm sure I will share a bit more about myself as we move into things, but that's a start.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Leanne Chen, and I also use she, her pronouns. I'm the executive director at My Girls in Action. Very excited to be a part of the panel this evening, and just a little bit about who I am. I actually came to the US as a refugee child. My family and I left Cambodia, and we lived in the Thai refugee camp for a few years before resettling in the US. And we resettled in East Oakland in the mid-'80s. Where a lot of refugees at that time were being resettled in impoverished urban neighborhoods across the US. And Long Beach actually has the largest Cambodian diaspora in the US. And so, and a lot of my childhood experience really shaped how I think about our current work and some of the issues that we're going to dive into today. Thank you for having me.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Manjusha Kulkarni. I also go by Manju and use she, her pronouns. I'm the co-founder of StopAAPIHate and also executive director of the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, APCON. We're a coalition of over 40 community-based organizations that serve and represent the 1.5 million Asian American and Pacific Islanders in Los Angeles County. Really proud to be on this panel with these esteemed panelists, and especially Leanne, who is executive director of one of our member organizations. In terms of my own background, prior to coming to APCON, I was at the South Asian Network, which is also a member organization of APCON and serves specifically the South Asian American community. And before that, worked in civil rights and health law, focusing on issues affecting communities of color and also specifically women of color and their experiences. Really glad to be with you all today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lacey. I'm an activist based in LA, but I was raised in Orange County, and so Little Saigon is always home. And I'm also a member of RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network Speakers Bureau, and they're the ones that run the National Sexual Assault Hotline. I grew up, as I mentioned, in Orange County, And I was a survivor of teen dating violence, but at the time, it's not the language that I used to describe it because I was growing up in a community that really didn't view what was happening to me as sexual violence. So most of my work has been organizing around how we educate within our community to really understand the tools and language around sexual violence.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. Really excited to have all of you here and also just excited to hear from all of you when we hop into the panel discussion. I just wanted to offer a little bit of background about why we're gathered here tonight. So tonight's panel discussion is an extension of a 3-part series that I wrote last year for Times OC with support from the Center for Health Journalism. And that fellowship project culminated with a community forum that centered on access to mental health care services in OC's Cambodian and Vietnamese communities. And during that event, 2 of the panelists, including the director of the OC Healthcare Agency, suggested that we continue having the conversation around mental health care access by having a part 2 of that forum. And so tonight's event is part 2 of that forum. And so for tonight's event, we decided that we wanted to center this discussion around gender-based violence in the Asian American community because of the rise of anti-Asian hate during the coronavirus pandemic. And it was really important that the second forum covered an issue or a topic that reflected what's important to the communities that were part of the first project. And we also decided to expand it to the broader Asian American community in light of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month and also Mental Health Awareness Month. So at this time, before I invite Ada just to provide a little bit more context about tonight's discussion, I'd just like to take a moment of silence to honor the Asian American community, and in particular, those who have been victims of anti-Asian hate and gender-based violence. Thank you, everybody. I'd like to now turn it over to Ada.
Hi, yeah, so I just wanted to start by giving a little bit of context so we can all be on the same page, because I know we all know that this is really important, but sometimes it just sort of helps to look at the numbers and have a little bit of a sense of the statistics. In this moment right now, we know there's escalating anti-Asian hate, and a lot of these reports are coming from women. And even before the pandemic, if you look at the numbers, we just have very high percentages of AAPI women reporting abuse. And we also know that we're less likely to report it, even if it is happening to us. So that's some of the context. And then this panel is about gender-based violence. So I wanted to provide like a very quick definition of gender-based violence, but basically it's largely male pattern violence that influences or is influenced by gender relations. And I also wanted to kind of contextualize the history, like even though this, these things are more in the mainstream now, partially because the Atlanta spa shootings and all the craziness happening right now, we know that this stuff has been going on for a really long time, for over a century. We hear a lot about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was a law that prevented, the first and only law to prevent all members of a specific ethnic or national group from coming here. But not as many people realize that 7 years before that, there was the Page Act, which prevented Chinese women from entering the United States. And the assumption was that, we were prostitutes, basically. So just to have that sort of context that these stereotypes that affect us now have a really, really long history. So I guess we'll stop sharing and start with the panel person. Agnes, you want to begin?
Sure, yeah. So we'll go ahead and dive into our first question. And the first question I wanted to ask all of our panelists is, what does gender-based violence look like in our communities? And maybe we could start with you, Lacey, if you could go ahead and answer that question first.
Of course, thank you. That's such a broad question. And I feel like there's sort of 2 elements to it. I think there's the violence we face from other communities. I think Atlanta shooting is the most recent in the memory, but this has been longstanding. We see the Page Act from the get-go. We've been viewing Chinese, but Asian American women as prostitutes. And I think that's still reinforced very heavily in our media, including some of my favorite video games and films and TV shows, but how often we really do look at Asian and specifically Asian women as hypersexualized, as submissive, all of these things. And while I'm loving the popularity of anime and K-pop and that culture, it also has created an element of seeing Asian and Asian women's bodies as something to consume, something that we own. And that is a large part why some people view us as lacking in agency, that we belong to someone else. And I think that's super crucial. But also looking inwards, there's such high rates of gender-based violence within our own communities. To say Asian is the broadest term of all time, so I'll speak at least to being Vietnamese and Vietnamese American, is that we often look at sexual violence as something, you know, especially domestic violence, as something that your partner is entitled to sex, entitled to ownership of your body, because that runs so deep in our communities. So as Anthony Ada already mentioned, we may not even claiming these things as sexual violence because we don't have the language or think of it as violence.
Great, thank you so much, Lacey. Oh, Manju, do you want to jump in?
Yes, please. So I wanted to just share some of the data from StopAAPIHate. We are the nation's leading aggregator of hate incidents that are reported from across the country and involve largely COVID-19 related hate, but now we're also starting to see other forms of hate as well. Between March of 2020 and the end of March of this year, we've received over 6,600 incident reports from all across the country. These include verbal harassment, acts of discrimination in the workplace and housing, as well as in retail as public accommodations. And then finally also as physical attacks, including the ones in Atlanta and also Indianapolis. Some of the worst, of course, that we've seen against our communities. As I mentioned, they're happening all across the country, in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, and also impacting essentially every part of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. So while Chinese Americans represent a plurality of those who've reported to us, we also know that Koreans, Vietnamese, Filipinos are experiencing hate in large numbers, and even South Asians and Pacific Islanders who may not be perceived as being East Asian are also experiencing similar types of hate. And what's most noteworthy for this panel is, of course, the fact that 65% of the incident reports come from women. So we see that women actually are bearing the brunt of this racism and discrimination. And much of it is, as Lacey pointed out, really tinged with sexualized violence and hypersexuality, where we see many women who've reported to us say they've been sexually harassed as part of the incident that they've experienced. But because of intersectionality, also we have those elements of racism where the racial slurs are used as part of the attack. And so, I wanted to share some of that data with you as we start to sort of think about the ways in which this newest form of hate directed at our communities, in fact, is targeting women.
Thank you, Manju. I think those stats are really helpful. And also just noting that almost 2/3 of the incidents reported come from women. I think that's very helpful context to know just coming into this conversation. So thank you for sharing that. I wanted to ask Leanne if you also wanted to answer the question, what does gender-based violence look like in our communities?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. And I just, a lot of what I've been thinking deeply about, because this question really brings back a lot of past memories for me, just in terms of just thinking about the context of like the refugee resettlement for myself, my family, and the community at large. And I think earlier I mentioned, a lot of the Southeast Asian refugees were resettled in impoverished urban neighborhoods, and in neighborhoods that have been historically disinvested in with fragile infrastructure, and communities that are coming from war-torn country, genocide, and forced migration into into housing projects, and that's where I grew up in. And I really remember like just the sound of police siren a lot growing up, and my parents' PTSD as well as the nighttime, like at night when my father will scream and wake up from just the nightmares that he's having. And so, and you know, and I feel like there's something around the legacy of the genocidal horror of the Khmer Rouge that get transported into resettled community that is in the diaspora, that, you know, that in the diaspora community. And so that, in fact, actually manifests in higher level of violence that we see in our community. And there are a lot of different tiers of violence. So I just want to put out there that, like, you know, there's the violence of poverty, violence of attending poorly resourced school, violence of living in heavily policed neighborhoods, and violence of in the home, you know. And so, and a lot of that is, you know, my understanding of that is that that is really compounded trauma that community face through that process. And so, you know, with the context of the pandemic, you know, in this past year, which, by the way, shout out to everybody getting through the pandemic in this crazy unrelenting time of our lives. But, you know, with the added stress of the pandemic and the current rise in anti-Asian violence, you know, like our organization at the beginning of the pandemic got an uptick in domestic violence call and calls of feeling of unsafe in the home. Ranging from women and young people in the community. And so that was something that pretty much happened pretty immediately. And there's also like in the, and I'm gonna speak specifically about the Cambodian community in Long Beach, where a lot of, you know, we have very high percentage of low-income Cambodian folks living in Long Beach, particularly in central Long Beach, which really heavy, high density rental community, multi-generational household, so much stress when people were put under the safer at home order. And then also suddenly just having to be facing each other all the time, high stress, loss of economic security. Folks lost their jobs. There was almost pretty immediately, we were getting calls around what to do, how to file for unemployment. And that level of stress really led to some of the additional challenges that we saw in our community. And I would say too, that like for women and girls, we carry other type of stress in our community because we hold so much of both the emotional labor, but in the Cambodian community, also the economic breadwinning happen with a lot of young people in the family, as well as with the women in the family, because even during the pandemic, we were, our community were experiencing deportation. And so that's another layer of like loss and family separation. And so, you know, and so, so there's just like a lot of different tiers of violence. And I think the gender-based violence, like we really see an uptick in that in this time.
Thanks, Leanne. I think it is really helpful to hear all of that there's so many layers to this, and just kind of hearing all of those layers, and also just about all these other stressors that kind of compounded, you know, in addition to the pandemic and you know, in the rise of calls to Khmer Girls in Action regarding gender-based violence. Anjali, would you also like to offer some insight about what gender-based violence looks like in our communities? And you know, so far we're hearing like it really looks different. You know, it's kind of easy to just kind of lump all Asian Americans together, right? But specific communities kind of have different things. So just wanted to hear kind of your input on that.
Yeah, I think, so I think like bringing in sort of a psychology perspective into this, like when we're hearing about these statistics that are, you know, essentially evidence of structural oppression, right? The structural oppression of poverty, of gender, patriarchy, white supremacy, all of these structural oppressions directly impact gender-based violence. And so in terms of how I think about that psychologically is sort of like, how does violence, all of the different kinds of violence that we're talking about, shape and impact the psyche. So the psyche, both at an individual level and at a collective sort of a level. So like, what happens to a community of people who's been chronically traumatized by structural oppression, right? Whether that's like war, various types of violence. And so just in like the short or the sort of most simple answer to that question of like, what does gender-based violence look like in our communities? From my perspective, the first words that popped into my head are, it looks like shame, secrecy, fear, depression, anxiety. And so like in my practice and in the work I've done in some of the community-based organizations, like I have a high number of Asian women clients. The levels of violence that are happening both within their families of origin, right? And all of the shame that comes up there. And this is like across the spectrum of like many different Asian communities, South Asian, East Asian, Southeast Asian. There's that piece, and then there's the violence that they're experiencing out in the world, right? Because of the ways in which they are objectified and the expectations that are placed on their bodies and how they show up in this world. So from a psychological perspective, I think it's important to like take all the structural oppression statistics, all the knowledge we have, and look at how is that actually manifesting and showing up in the body and the psyche. And I don't know if this is getting too psychology-y, but I think it is helpful. When I learned this, it really shifted my understanding of how I walk in this world. When I learned the ways in which violence and trauma impacts us, in our brain, there's like a certain part of our brain, which is the amygdala. I don't know if you all are familiar with this term, and it's at the base of the brain, and it's the part of the brain that controls the fear response: fight, flight, freeze, right? When that is activated, essentially all of the blood goes away from the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your mind that, you know, controls your ability to think clearly, to think in a logical way, to be able to make smart choices. And it goes towards the limbs to prepare you to, you know, fight or flight or freeze. And when people describe the sensation or the feeling of like, in the midst of trauma or afterwards, that idea of like, I couldn't think, that's because you literally cannot think. Like all of the blood has gone away from the part of your brain that allows you to think clearly because you're trying to stay safe. When that sort of dysregulation is happening on a chronic level, right? When day in and day out, you're either coming from a society that's chronically traumatized, and then as well as at the individual level, what it causes is like a deep hypervigilance as you walk in the world, right? That dysregulation is not good for us. It's not healthy for us physically, emotionally, and it impacts our intimacy with other people, our relationships. So yeah, I think, I don't know if that's kind of bringing it really to a very biological sort of a level, but I think it's important for us to recognize how this violence and these structural oppressions manifest at that sort of a level. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in, but I think thinking about that is so helpful, because when you talk about all these responses, like I don't want to speak for everyone, but I recognize that in my behavior, but I don't think I know what it is. You know what I mean? Like that happens to me a lot, where I'm like, why am I acting like this? And then once you like have someone like that explain it to you, then you feel a little bit, you understand why you're doing certain things. And I mean, that's what therapy is for, right? Like there's a reason, right? And I think I think it's one of those things where when we talk about gender-based violence and just sort of having to be hyper vigilant in this world, right? I think it's something that we all know, and we, not all, I don't want to generalize, but it's like a lot of us know and a lot of us do. And during this time, especially, where we're just flooded with all of these images and incidents all the time. And of course it's in the news and it's splashed all over headlines, but it's also in our social media feeds. It's what our friends are sharing, and even the stuff that's not in the headlines, just sort of seeing that every day. And it's not only us, but it's like people who look like our parents. You know what I mean? So I'm so grateful to all of you to, just to talk about this. We titled this, "How do we talk about Asian American gender-based violence?" Because I think it is really hard to talk about. I think all of you who have been doing the work, it's maybe a little bit easier for y'all to talk about, but I think there's just so much stigma in our communities and we don't talk about it, and I think we have to start talking about it. So I guess that'll move us on to the next thing, and we cannot kind of always go back and forth, but now that we have a little bit of an understanding of what it looks like in all of our different communities, I guess the idea is like, what can we do about it? Like, what can help? What's some of the work that you all have been doing, and are there any recommendations, whether it's like calls to action or just how can we think about this in a way that helps us grapple with our reality? I don't know if Manju, do you want to start?
Sure, and actually to your, the point you just made, Ada, I mean, I do want to acknowledge that unfortunately, the violence against women generally, and certainly against Asian American and Pacific Islander women, has often been thought of as sort of titillating, and we see it sensationalized in the news coverage. One thing I wanted to mention specifically about the data that we have is that 90 to 95% of what's reported to StopAAPIHate does not involve an underlying crime or criminal element. And that's important to remember when we do think of solutions, because much of it is, the day-to-day discrimination in the workplace, in housing, in retail, as well as verbally harassing comments, things that happen at schools and universities. So to remember that too, because I think when we do talk about what the solutions look like, for us, it's very much, beyond just simply hate crimes enforcement. And we know that we're not going to police our way out of anti-Asian American hate, but that actually we need comprehensive solutions. And so when we talk about what that looks like, it's resources for community members that are in language and culturally appropriate. Those include very much mental health services, as well as legal resources, immigration resources. In fact, that's what the families of victims in Atlanta said they wanted and needed, and not simply more law enforcement or more police in their communities. And I think Leanne mentioned correctly exactly what that does, the trauma that ensues from it. And I think too, what we need is really a stronger civil rights infrastructure so that people get the help they need. And then we address these systemic types of discrimination, because that's really where it happens. The place where we see the greatest amount of hate is actually at businesses. And that's what I said, workplace discrimination, housing, and then we see it, a fair number in schools and universities, as well as public streets, public parks. So I think we have to think very broadly about what public safety means, especially for women. And some of that involves economic safety and mobility. It includes living in communities where you can breathe fresh air. It means, older women getting access to resources they need, just beyond even Social Security. So there are, I think, a lot of these components that organizations, including the ones that are represented here, have been talking about for a long time. And I think they haven't necessarily gotten the attention they deserve because they're not again, as titillating or as sensational as the ones that are drawn upon when you see that violence on the screen.
Yeah, definitely. I was revisiting the report, and I think a lot of the fact that a lot of the is happening in businesses, that stuck out to me too, because I think a lot of the stuff that makes the news is stuff that's happening in public, like parks and you know, public transportation and stuff. But it's interesting to know that it's happening in businesses. Leanne, would you like to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Manju, for you know, for sharing so much of the solution that is needed. You know, for me, I always come back to like, we really, you know, as a society, we really need robust safety nets for all of our community. A lot of the tension and the hardship and the challenges, you know, really result in structural and institutional conditions that people feel like they're being pitted against each other. And to me, that's such, you know, that's such BS at the end of the day, right? Like and we're such a wealthy country, and it just feels so completely ridiculous, you know, that the racism, sexism, you know, all the issues that is like now we're confronted with, and the pandemic have really heightened everything. That it, you know, that coming out of you know, the pandemic, one of the best things we could do for all of us collectively is really go all in on how we think about the you know, a robust safety net for all of our collective community, improving that, improving everybody's basic access to, you know, to rights, so that they can reduce trauma, reduce the poverty, so that folks feel a sense of stability in their lives. I think something that's also super important is work in solidarity across communities of color and other communities, low-income communities, because folks have been working and dealing with a lot of these issues for a really long time. And I really love this concept around what does it mean for us to build, to really think about our community and to build a community care around ourselves and with each other. And I think what was really beautiful during the pandemic, despite how hard it was, how hard it still is the mutual aid component that have like just really emerged from many communities, and the reliance of us of being with each other and supporting each other. And quite honestly, this understanding that we are all in, we all have a sense of mutual, like we live in mutuality, right? And so like what I'm putting the mask on for my safety, but also for other people's safety, right? And so we all kind of in some way are interconnected and connected to each other. Something that's also really important is really thinking about like how we bring in and support the voices of folks who are most impacted to help shape solutions. You know, like women and girls who are really impacted by gender-based violence, for their voices to really be heard and to help shape the solution that makes sense for them. And we think that that's really important in this issue and also in other issues in the community, because there's something really healing about being able to shape a solution for what's happening in your life. And to empower women and girls to have the type of agency that could really shift their condition. And we find that in our work, when we're able to do that, it really interrupts people's kind of like they're spiraling when they're dealing with trauma. Like it really kind of interrupts that when we could really empower young people to really think about like, what is a more healing center approach to what I'm dealing with in my family, in my community, in my neighborhoods. And we really do also think that there needs to be some like structural funding that really reach communities, culturally competent related, you know, programming and care for the community, as well as language access stuff, because the API community is so big and so broad and so diverse and so dynamic. And for so long, there's no disaggregated data about our community, and very little disaggregated data about, even the issues that we're talking about, tonight, right? And so and having some disaggregated and consistent data that help us be, have targeted solution, to some of the challenges that has been coming up. And so, yeah, and I think like some of the groups and the practitioners that are working directly with folks and just really thinking about like the type of resources and the healing approach that is necessary in this time. And I also do think that because a lot of other communities are dealing with similar issues, there's so much of cross-learning that we could do. And so this piece around solidarity and learning from each other and really sharpening our skill set on how to support our community and on how we could collectively heal, I think will be a very important process for us.
Thank you so much for that. I really love hearing you talk about working with youth and kind of shaping what they, how they think about themselves, and I think for us, that's kind of looking back, that's not what we had. I mean, Lacey kind of brought that up where it's like, we didn't have the language to talk about this, and we didn't, even if it happened to us, maybe we didn't even know what it was. So I wonder, maybe I can pass it to Lacey to talk a little bit more about this.
No, absolutely. And Leanne, I'm so grateful for all of your work. And I think to that point, I think something so crucial for me is cultural competency in a lot of programs beyond that. Again, like I grew up not really knowing the language around sexual violence. And I think my first introduction to those topics, and I think for a lot of folks too, is in colleges. It is definitely like the first time you get at least a 101 style introduction, but they're all taught in very generic terms. And so whatever you're being told there is not going to undo the thinking that you had for the past 18 years. And so how we really tie in cultural competency in people's upbringings as we teach folks about sexual violence, I think is super important. And into that as well, I think everyone has already brought this up, but cultural competency in all the services we're providing. I'm the first person to tout like Rain Sexual Violence Hotline or the text chat, but let's be honest, if it's not in language, if it's not, that doesn't offer these things, all of the resources, especially for immigrant communities and refugee communities, you're not going to know the structures and styles and nonprofit structures of a new country at all. So how are you able to even seek out resources when there's not active outreach done in those areas? And I think kind of going back also then finally to like my earlier piece about, it is about the content that we create and the content we choose to consume. How are we pushing film and TV shows to change the way we view Asian Americans, Asian American women in general? And then even also as a consumer, what is your duty of what you want to watch and what you choose to consume? We build media based on what we think is going on.
Oh, we might have lost Lacey a little bit.
If I could just jump in for 1 second to respond to Lacey's points, two things. One of my side jobs is actually as a lecturer at UCLA in Asian American Studies. And so I would definitely encourage folks in that vein to take classes in ethnic studies to get more than what is a cursory understanding of our communities. I know at UCLA we have many courses that are not only taught by Asian American and Pacific Islander professors, women professors, but also classes about women in our community, as well as folks who are trans and don't necessarily identify according to traditional binary, the gender binary. So, I would say that, and I also wanted to point to a report that came out just this week on the depictions of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in film. And we see that there are actually many more movies that have actors that are named Tom and John and Bill than we do Asian American women in any of these films. And sadly, one of the things that came out of this report is that of the ones that had Asian American leads or co-leads, 25% of them were killed off by the end of the movie. So I wanted to point that out too, in terms of what we understand the violence against our communities being, which is that they're depicted every day in mainstream media and in, you know, narratives that we see on the big and small screen.
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad you brought up that study, because I was looking through it recently too, and it kind of goes through like the really popular mainstream films, right, and how we're depicted. And my background is reporting on like Asian American films and arts and entertainment, and I almost feel like it was kind of a luxury for me to have that job for so long, because I wasn't watching any of that, you know what I mean? And so that's just like a quick plug to watch the Asian American films that, you know, back in the day it might have been really hard for you to watch because they're only at film festivals, or you'd have to go to somebody's show in person. But nowadays a lot of them are streaming and online, and that's where you find a lot of kind of the good work that we're not getting killed off at the end. But yeah, I think we lost Lacey for a little bit, but we'll come back to her when she comes back. Anjali, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, there were so many insightful things that were just shared about what do we do to actually address this issue, you know, within our communities. And so I don't want to repeat things that were already said, that I think were very, very on point. And in thinking about kind of what I can add to that, I think one of the first steps really to addressing this issue is really to raise the education and critical consciousness within our communities to like actually understand the impact of longstanding violence and structural oppressions on our communities. So understanding the links between disenfranchisement, right, and how that contributes to gender-based violence. So I'm thinking about, for example, within the Indian community, you know, I come from a family that lived through partition, which, you know, was one of the most violent intercountry transfers of the entire century. And my relatives won't talk about it. You know, people who lived through this trauma and the ways in which that shaped a scarcity mentality, a trauma-rooted way of thinking, a hyper-vigilant, fearful way of walking in the world, and how that directly then increased the gender-based violence within our family, within our communities. Because without having the tools to talk about the pain or process the trauma or heal, who does it tend to come out on are the most vulnerable people, which tend to be the women and children, right? And so like thinking about the first steps of what do we do as a community is increase the internal conversations I think we're having in our communities around understanding how we've all been shaped by the legacies of intergenerational trauma, of violence, and then understanding how that manifests here in the US as immigrants, essentially, right? So there's a whole other level of like trauma that comes with being an immigrant, you know, here in this country. So yeah, thinking about like that first step is education. And then I think a couple people brought up the idea we need social services that are culturally responsive and competent. And yes, like I'm in a field where, you know, 86% of psychologists are white. And I was very much a loner, like through my training, and coming from the Western field of psychology, where the problems tend to be located in the individual. So individuals are pathologized when actually so much of the trauma, dysregulation, the things that we as individuals and our communities are experiencing are the result of structural oppressions, right? So then healing in that sense can't necessarily just happen at an individual level. If the traumatization was happening at a societal level, the healing needs to happen at a societal level, right? And so that's where I think the conversations we need to have within our communities to openly talk about our talk about our histories and how this shapes us psychologically, and how this manifests. And so I think that's the first step. I mean, I think also then returning to some of the indigenous forms of healing that existed in our community. So yes, I'm a Western trained psychologist, and I don't think individual therapy is the answer to everything. I think it can be super helpful, and it can definitely support someone through the healing process, provide them with tools and insights. And I think that there's also forms of healing that are indigenous to our communities that we sometimes are pretty disconnected from. And there would be a lot of benefit in returning to some of those in order to facilitate healing. I have many other thoughts about like individual therapy and trauma treatment and things like that, but probably like too much to share today.
No, I would love to hear more. I would love to hear more about what are some examples of the solutions that are indigenous to our communities that we might not know about.
Well, so like interestingly enough, right, in the West, trauma treatment has largely been based in talk therapy. And in most of the communities across the globe, the way people heal through pain and trauma was not through talk, right? It was through eating together, through movement, through ritual, through dance, through sometimes storytelling. And of course, Western science is finally catching up with the fact that they've done some studies now and have come to understand that trauma is actually stored in the right side of the brain. And the right side of the brain can really only be accessed through art, through ritual, through movement. So like talk therapy really like fundamentally scientifically has its limits in terms of the degree to which it can heal. Like I think it's an important part of the healing process, like being able to tell your story and retell your story from an empowered perspective is really important. And it's not going to address necessarily the ways in which trauma is stored in the body. And in the sort of collective history, it's not going to address the intergenerational pieces, you know? So like some of the indigenous things are to come back to some of those rituals when people actually gathered together as a community and engaged in eating together or movements or things like that could actually release things. There's also a lot of herbal things, like through Ayurveda, through so many different forms of healing from across the globe. Again, the West has largely looked down upon this idea that kind of what we eat or the herbs that we ingest are going to impact our psychological healing. But recently, of course, they're catching up and seeing that actually a lot of the gut, which is the place where we produce like serotonin and all of these chemicals that actually impact our mood, it's all produced in the gut, which is directly impacted by the foods we're going to eat, the herbs that we're going to try, right? And this knowledge has existed in Asian communities for centuries, right? So I think that is also a really important part of the healing. And then, of course, like I'm an advisory board member for the National Queer and Transgender Therapists of Color Network. And part of the drive to join that was because we're trying to create a network of people of color therapists who are going to approach healing from a decolonized sort of a perspective, you know? And so we need more of that. And if anyone's interested, I do have directories of like various communities. If you're trying to find a therapist who's from an Asian community or some other community, we do have those directories out there. We need more of that. And then we need more community building, I think, across those directories to actually support one another's work so that then we can support clients as well.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah,
we have, at the utility team, we've done some stories, a lot of stories on mental health. And interviewed Anjali for some of them, including one about how to find a therapist. And that's a huge part of it. Like, how do you find a culturally competent therapist? You know, especially, you know, looking at now, like, you know, maybe a lot of these stressors are very specific to being an Asian American woman, you know, and maybe you when you talk about it, you feel more comfortable talking to somebody who kind of feels it in their bones, you know what I mean, as opposed to somebody who's addressing it intellectually, you know what I mean? So right. I think, yeah, I'm wondering, I don't know, because this is stuff that came up in Agnes's project about, you know, culturally sensitive healthcare and mental health care in the Cambodian and Vietnamese community. I wonder if Leanne, do you want to share a little bit about kind of some of the healing practices in the Cambodian community? Or?
Yeah, you know, I was just gonna really diddle some of the stuff that Dr. Anjali just mentioned, because there are a lot of indigenous roots and practices that don't get resourced or funded because we're not, quote unquote, what do they call it?
Evidence-based. I have this argument all the time with funders and researchers about this, who, even that's a political thing, who gets to decide what's evidence-based, who has access to the money to do the research to prove that what you're doing is evidence-based.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, all good. Weigh in however you want to.
Read Agnes's story to learn more about that. So go ahead.
Yeah, so there's not going to be enough time to really go through everything, but I do think that there's something around the like mind, body, spiritual approach that get discounted a lot in Western style therapy. And then there's also in the talk therapy style, it's also very individualized versus our community heal oftentimes collectively. And so part of the strategy with our young people oftentimes is that, you know, we do a lot of healing circles with each other, storytelling circles, you know, and we center a lot of our meetings around food because it's super important to us and we all love to eat. So, you know, so I think there's a lot of that piece. And then also, you know, like there's you know, also historically, there's a way in which like the monks in the temple really play a central role for healing, for the passing of spirit. You know, I was just thinking about like during the pandemic when a lot of folks passed away and we weren't able to do our traditional practice, like just how hard that was for the psyche of everybody, and what would it mean to kind of like just do a collective you know, support and a collective ritual around that as a larger community as we're coming out of this, and just how important that would be to just like ground ourselves in that healing process. And you know, and then just to say something about like men and men's work, because I'm seeing Andrew on the chat. An intervention that KJ has been working on with we actually have, not a lot of people know about this, but we actually have a young men's empowerment program in our organization. And the reason for that is all day, every day, we think about how do we smash patriarchy? And what is the role of the boys and men in our community? Because we train amazing, powerful young women, and they go back to the community and they still get abused by the men and the folks they are, you know, that they're dating. And so like there's all kinds of stuff like have emerged over time. And so part of the Young Men's Empowerment Program is actually thinking about how we train up and support the boys in our community to really think about masculinity differently. And what does healthy masculinity look like? And what does it really mean to be an ally and a supporter of the women and girls in your lives? And so, and we actually have our young men practice, the young men in our program actually practice how to do that and to work in solidarity with our women and girls. And we do have specific campaign and programs that they take part in. And so, you know, and so it's I would say that it's not easy, but it's also important to have safe space for men and boys to have those type of conversation, because we found that a lot of our boys had so much issues and tension with the ways in which their relationship are with their fathers, and the way in which their fathers treat their mothers and their sisters and their aunts and, you know, that kind of stuff. So a lot of stuff can emerge, and that they also need safe spaces to have those conversations and also to actively practice being allies and supporter and awesome feminists to the women and girls in their lives.
If I could add, oh, go ahead, please.
I'm gonna go quick. I think also to that is to encourage all of them in your life to actually volunteer as well. I think I talked to a lot of really amazing male allies, but then who do actively talk to me about the fact that they didn't have male mentors in their life to teach them these things. And so it was a learning process for them. And so for me, I've always stressed like, well, now it's your turn to go out and mentor, to volunteer back in our communities so you can pass those messages along too.
And what I wanted to add is that in other parts of APCON's work, we have a project on domestic violence prevention for Asian American communities, and we look specifically at Chinese, Korean, Cambodian, and South Asian. And what we found from that work is that there are two underlying foundations that help to prevent domestic violence in those communities. And one is promoting empathy, and both men as well as women, parents, really encouraging that as an underlying philosophy within a family structure, so that people understand what it means to cause harm, to cause pain to others, and then understanding, of course, what it means then to pull back or to avoid those type of behaviors. And the other is, not surprisingly, gender equality. Right, so when we saw in our focus groups where there was significant gender equality in these 4 communities, there was much less domestic violence. Whereas when we had significant inequality and inequities, you had a significant amount of domestic violence. So I think that's something we can take with us moving forward. You know, as we work with communities and as we have our own families, and think about what are the guiding principles that we want to instill in our children.
Thank you so much for that. I wanted to give Lacey a chance to continue because we got cut off for a little bit. And I know you've done a lot of work around these policies in colleges and stuff. I think you're being kind of modest about it, but is there more that you want to kind of talk about from your perspective?
Oh gosh, I did a lot of organizing in colleges, and I think 2 of the biggest lessons I took away was, one, like, to have Dr. Anjali on this call is like bananas to me, because I could not find a female therapist, and specifically a woman of color therapist, was unbelievably hard. And I was there when my university, I was on the hiring committee for the first school therapist that was actually trained on interpersonal violence, and they didn't give us a single candidate of color to consider. So all of this cultural context was not helpful. And I think the same happened, you know, my violence goes back to when I was in high school, and I went to the school therapist there who also lacked any of the cultural training needed for that. So the way we also organize these support services, and instead of just making it the sexual violence programming, but actually integrate those into all of the diversity programs that are already existing, I think is so crucial. I also was one of the people who taught, you know, those intro workshops to all the freshmen, all of the fraternities and sororities and the clubs. And I actually thought it was so much more important, I think, to the earlier question, was to have more men and more people from majority communities actually help teach some of those lessons. Because it's one thing for me as a woman to go yell at all the men and be like, hi, can you please be less terrible, versus how men are able to have those conversations and really access different parts of their trauma, their oppression, and why they think like that is something I can't do because I don't know that experience. And so really recruiting more people from majority communities into these trainings was so crucial to me, because I think it helps create that peer-to-peer connection that is needed when we talk about issues like this.
Yeah, for sure. I thought, so we're getting some great comments, so I wanted to bring up a comment from Katie who talks about, she said, I think language is such an interesting lens for this conversation. I recall that the earliest coverage of the Atlanta shootings referred to the sites of murders as massage parlors, and the language shifted to spas only later. I was so offended and upset about those words. So I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts about not only, like, you know, the massage parlor spa thing, but language and how we can talk about this.
I can start just specifically about that incident What I can say in terms of the language is, when we saw the press conference the day after the Atlanta shooting, it was troubling on so many levels, and levels that are relevant for this conversation, which is that law enforcement really seemed to act as the defense attorney for the perpetrator, offering so much exculpatory information about why it wasn't a hate crime. He was just having a bad day, we were told. He had a sex addiction, and so for some reason he couldn't have a sex addiction and then also be a racist, misogynist. And to that, the gentleman perpetrator himself said that he didn't commit, that he didn't have any racial animus. So I think in terms of some of that language, it was very interesting as someone working on these issues to see that there were efforts to really exonerate a perpetrator, especially in a case that was so obvious to many of us in terms of the targeting behavior and the fact that sex especially was used. If you remember the language, he said the perpetrator had a sex addiction he was looking to relieve himself of on these women. So just imagine the horrible graphic that creates in terms of that language. And again, the sexualized misogyny against women. I think on multiple levels, it was just so horrific, and not surprising that that officer was actually pulled off of the case when it was revealed that he himself was selling T-shirts of the China virus on his Facebook page. So when people ask us why we don't necessarily trust law enforcement, I think that's a good example of why, when we see white supremacy really infiltrating law enforcement and law enforcement officers.
Yeah, for sure. Does anyone else want to jump in there?
I just wanted to say, ditto to what Manju already said, but just think about the former president's language and words and what it had really created, and the tense environment, and the blaming and the finger pointing and, and just the disgusting usage of the way he talked about women. So I think all that contributes to the climate of hate and to the climates of blaming each other, and so language absolutely is really important. And I think everybody have a very important role to think about how we utilize language, and I also want to challenge the media to really think about what type of story you're putting out and how you're framing the story, because that has a really big impact, on how communities and how folks understand, and it really shapes people's perspective. And so, so I think I just wanted to add that 2 cents.
No, absolutely. And I think that's so crucial, especially around, I think what we've talked about so much is violence. Honestly, the answer, it needs to be putting survivors back in the driver's seat and back in control of their own agency. And I think always in response to mass shootings, but especially Atlanta, the headline will always be about the shooter first. The shooter first, this person with these descriptions killed 9 people. Oh, killed 9 women, something else. And so few stories are actually focused on the lives. We know these women now for the worst thing that has ever happened to them versus their lives and the lives that they've lived, and also the impact that their deaths have had. And so where were the articles also about what the mental health impact has been on Asian women who are now scared to go back to their jobs at nail salons or front, consumer facing businesses? Where are all those articles that really center what this has been like for specifically older Asian women? I think immediate responses, especially because we are culture, especially in the film and TV we create, that really does glorify policing and murder. We all at some point have watched just a CBS procedural on crime, are so infatuated with the idea of what's behind the mind of the killers, as opposed to really what the impact is on the communities who have been victimized.
Yeah, for sure. That's actually one of the questions we have in the Q&A. Media representation plays a huge role in how communities are viewed and treated, as seen in the AAPI community. How, as a member of the media, can I do better? I don't know if that's a question for me and Agnes. but I think when I think about that question, it's tricky because we are members of the media, but we're also readers, right? We're also citizens. We're also people who see the same headlines. And I think it's hard for us too, to try to figure out what to do. Like, I just remember seeing the headlines, or just anytime I see a headline, right? Like, am I thinking about it as like a person from the media, or am I just thinking about it as an Asian American woman who's just trying to like figure out if I'm safe, right? And I think part of what's hard about it is kind of what we all keep talking about, like it's structural, right? Where if there were more of those stories, about just Asian American women being themselves, I mean, and all the great things that we do all the time when we're not being killed and we're not being harassed and we're not, you know what I mean? And it goes back to that report, right? If, there were kind of full representations of like, that make us feel like how we actually feel, as opposed to how sometimes we feel when we read about ourselves in the media. Then like when there is, like a report of the shooting, it would just feel like that. It would just feel like one report, right? But like when there isn't a broad range of stories, like suddenly that one report that is elevated so much, that feels like everything, right? I think that's kind of why it was hard for everybody. And it just continues to be hard for everybody, I think, to see just all these reports like over and over again. But I don't know, does anybody else have any ideas about
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think, Madeline, I really appreciate that question. And something that I've been doing lately whenever I interview community groups is I always ask, what is media not covering? What can we cover that is not being covered? And I've received a lot of really great answers, and I think something that like Lacey was saying, right, is there weren't a lot of stories on women who might have been afraid to go back to work. I absolutely, like, I didn't see any of that. And I think that would have been really great to have those stories. But yeah, like also we know that when these incidents happen, it's always the shooter shot this many people, right? And so I think just even hearing that from Lacey, I think that's helpful, because it helps like me and Ada kind of think about, when things like this happen, we can look at it from this different lens. So it's really helpful to ask people who are already working on the ground with these communities about because they're seeing it from that lens, and media does kind of miss a lot. So I think asking communities you're covering that question can kind of help improve coverage.
If I can just add one more thing to that, I really appreciate what you both shared, Ada and Agnes. I can't help but, when thinking about the media and how the media covers things, particularly when it's violence and shootings and things like that, the representation of mental illness is so incredibly problematic. The idea, like it is always presented as though the violence is a direct result of mental illness, which is really, really inaccurate. And I think it propagates these ideas that, one, are not true, and two, do not then place the onus of responsibility on structural oppression. So yes, could someone have a sex addiction and be racist? And that would be the contributing factors to why the violence took place. But the fact that it kind of, this sort of association with violence, whether it's gender-based violence or any other sort of violence, with mental illness alone, I think really just propagates certain ideas that are not true. And it's hard for the people. I worked with people with sex addiction. There are thousands of people with sex addiction who are not violent, so there's that. And I think it really like stops us from being able to have the larger conversations around, how is oppression playing into this? How is white supremacy playing into this? How is patriarchy playing into this? How, and those intersections I think are really important. I think the media could support us in having these conversations in a more mainstream way by including it in the articles. I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah, for sure. I wonder, maybe it's almost time. Do you guys want to just do like a quick final thoughts before we go? Who wants to go first? Or
I will
I just
jump in
kind of,
first.
okay, go.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for bringing this panel together. I think the one thing that I would hit on, since I think I've talked about media the most of all of us, is media creates what they think people will consume, what people will actually read. And so it's also on you to actively read at the articles and watch the TV shows that center our stories that we like and uplift that to prove that this is the content we want, and that can ultimately change the narrative.
For sure. Leanne, you want to go?
Sure. Yes, also my deep appreciation for the team of folks who put this panel together. And I hope we could have future panels and also more future opportunities for more voices to be a part of this process, including young voices and old voices and all the complexity of our community. And then finally, just wanting to say that I think it's super important for like COVID recovery, as well as the work of the many of the organizations that's on the ground to get proper support. And so if people and politicians and other folks who who are listening, it would be really great to think about like how to donate, how to support, how to create more structural funding that actually get down to the community organizations and to the practitioner and the folks in the front line that are really kind of helping and supporting community and ensuring that the folks who really need the resource in this time could properly recover from the challenges that we're facing.
Thank you so much. I love it because it's a pattern now of these panels that Agnes and I host, that in the middle of it, somebody says we should do a follow-up. And then we're always like, does that mean you're coming back? But thank you so much. Manju, do you want to go?
Sure. So I also want to just express my deep gratitude to the LA Times for putting this together and all of the wonderful panelists. I mean, what I would say is, in addition to supporting media, we need support for the work that these amazing folks are doing. And so that, takes tireless effort, and really even behind all of the organizations and the leaders and executive directors are mostly Asian American and Pacific Islander female staff. They're the ones doing the caregiving and the caretaking and supporting the emotional needs, not only of the communities, but also their families, their schools. And so I think, an effort to uplift what's happening there. I mean, back to the point of, we did get a chance, unfortunately it was after the shooting, but to see a little bit about these women whose lives were stolen from them, and to see that they in fact are us and we are them, and to make those connections and to realize that when we do express and understand empathy, that we know what we need and we understand what our communities need. And so it's time for all of us to get to work.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Anjali?
I just want to echo the deep appreciation and gratitude for having the chance to be a part of this conversation and to meet you all. And I think in terms of, a final thought, it is that I feel like this is really like just the beginning. I feel it was a really long day today of therapy and a lot of people suffering, and I feel filled up. I feel filled up, like seeing you all, the work that you're doing. And it feels like these conversations that are interdisciplinary, like those of us that are coming from different fields and different worlds as Asian American women, there's so much that we can do together, I think, if we are in dialogue more. And so, yeah, I do hope that there are more conversations like this that bring in, more people, elderly people, young people, people from different fields, so that we can be talking about these things more and really like facilitating healing for us, by us. Yeah, so thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It makes me feel good to hear you say that you feel filled up, because that's kind of what we were hoping for this kind of panel, you know, like as part of the utility team. It's kind of, you know, it's like, what do we do? Like we see all of this stuff that's hard, but what do we do about it? And it reminds me of what you've been saying, Anjali, and what you had told me in our interviews, where, you know, I think for a lot of us, we can probably relate to the idea that like when we think of healing, it's like community, like let's talk about it, let's find each other, let's watch each other cry, you know, like let's get, you know, let's like just acknowledge that this is a thing. And even though we have all these differences, like we can come together and lift each other, we can lift ourselves out of this, you know. And I hope this panel kind of was a little bit of that to all of, thank you for the people who are watching and the people who will watch in the future. There will be a recording of this that will be emailed to everybody who registered, and then you'll be able to share it with people who weren't able to join us live. And then just some really quick, like, housekeeping stuff. We talked about kind of, you know, centering our own stories and stuff. Like at the LA Times, we have a podcast called Asian Enough that just can't, you know, the second season just premiered. So I'd encourage everybody watching this to go listen to that. It's really great. It's, you know, just conversations about Asian Americans for Asian Americans, but everyone else can listen to, you know, and just like, what is it like when we talk to each other? You know what I mean? Like when we talk to people who are like us, and we, you know, we're not pretending. We just kind of say what we mean. And then also, oh, in the chat, there's a link to subscribe to the podcast. There's some really great stuff on our new daily podcast, The Times, that you should check out as well. That not only has Asian American, I mean, there's 2 Asian American producers behind it, 2 young Asian American producers behind it. And also, if you look at our website, there's, you know, just a ton of stories about kind of the anti-Asian, escalating anti-Asian hate and violence and stuff that just kind of keeps us informed. And there's like a video, and so check out all our stuff. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to all of you for coming and having this conversation. I also think it's a beginning, and a beautiful beginning. So thank you so much. Agnes, do you want to say anything, or?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone. I just want to echo that. And I learned a lot from all of you about this issue, and I'm glad that we were able to talk about it. I think it's really timely. And so, yeah, just a whole lot of gratitude for all of you. Thank you so much.
And let's hope that when we do a follow-up to this panel, it'll be in person and not over Zoom. All right, thanks everyone. I guess we'll, bye.